Hello, everybody. This is Pat DeSerbo, and we have Nick Masucci here today. Nick is the former CEO of Louis Berger Group, one of the largest civil engineering firms in America and globally, for almost 13 years. And he managed the firm through some of the most precarious periods of its existence. Nick was born in Brooklyn, New York, and grew up in Bergen County, New Jersey, in the town of Dumont. And he is married to Diane. And Nick has two children and two older sisters. And Nick is a graduate of Rutgers University, where he got a Bachelor of Science in City and Regional Planning and in Regional Economics. Welcome, Nick.
Welcome. Thank you.
My pleasure. What do you remember from Brooklyn, if anything?
What do I remember from Brooklyn? I remember the candy store on the corner. And I remember the house we lived in had a long staircase. After that, it tends to get pretty fuzzy.
How old were you when you moved?
I was, I guess 3 or 4 probably.
What were your mom and dad like?
Well, my mother, given the style of the time, was a homemaker. And my father was an accountant who worked in Manhattan.
What was your first job out of school?
Well, my first job out of graduate school was working for Louis Berger.
Okay.
I was hired. They had a brand new division there at Berger called Environmental Division, and I was hired in 1975, following in the footsteps of a Rutgers graduate who was hired the year before.
Who was that?
Peter Ciatoli.
Oh, okay. I was thinking it might have been Jim Bach, who I think you told me introduced you to Diane at some point.
Yes, he did. Actually, he and I were at Rutgers at the same time, and we graduated at the same time, and he went to. I'm trying to think where he went to. I don't remember what his first job was, but later he wound up at the Middlesex County Planning Board.
Okay.
And then after that, he went to work for Berger with me.
Mm-hmm. What was it like in the early days there?
In the early days, well, I don't want to say it was the Wild West, but it was primarily at the time full on engineering design in the United States, primarily in the transportation field. Berger had sold itself back in the late 60s. And in 1973, Dr. Berger bought the company back from the people he had sold it to. But he only bought a portion of the company back. He only bought 2 U.S. offices plus all of the international work. And so things were not very structured at the time.
Like from a revenue standpoint, how big of a company would that have been at that time? What he bought back?
Well, in the dollars of the day, I'd say it probably didn't exceed 25 million,
Mm-hmm.
with predominantly most of the business being overseas.
Mm.
Because I remember we used to say that the U.S. operation was 5% of the company at the time.
Wow. Was that common at that time, or was Berger kind of considered a leader in the?
On the international side?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, actually, it was very uncommon. Most of the American firms by the 70s had really withdrawn from working overseas, um, because it had become unprofitable, really. If you had a design operation, um, to try and have it do work overseas. Berger was one of the few American firms that were still in the international business,
Hmm.
and it operated differently than the other American ones had done prior to this point.
How so?
Well, on the design side, you'd like to have a design team that's worked together before, and so things operate smoothly, and you can really assure your quality. Uh, Berger, given the nature of the type of work we were doing for clients, you're really working in developing countries. Uh, you're not working in Europe. You're so Doc Berger had a philosophy of setting up shop uh, in the country we were working and producing, sending enough engineers to oversee in the work and hiring as many local engineers as he can. He had the philosophy that he part of his mission is not only to complete the project but to train others to do it in the future.
Hmm.
And that was a very effective at the time, and was a foundation of his success.
Hmm.
And as a function of that, we wound up opening companies in some countries that were perhaps the first engineering company within that country.
Hmm.
I know that was true of Nigeria and a couple of West African countries, other West African countries. That was true.
Hmm. That's fascinating. It's almost like a form of diplomacy.
Well, it's funny you say that because Doc Berger always used to believe we were an instrument of U.S. foreign policy.
I love it. In fact, the first podcast that I did was this guy named Dan Rundy. He's the head of a think tank in Washington, D.C., and he talks about what he calls soft power, which has more to do with the government, but a lot to do with training the local people to carry on after we leave.
The term soft power is exactly what I was going to say next. Having met over the years theorists from different kinds of think tanks or even from the U.S. government, uh, Berger was part of American soft power.
So when you started in the 70s, what was your job like? What were you?
Well, I was working on the U.S. side, this very small U.S. side of the company, and at that day we were into this newfangled thing that the government had recently required called environmental impact statements. I sat in an area that we always had a lot of people coming in and out of the office, and I sat with people that were working on some international projects for a while, and then they would go off, and I got to be pretty friendly with them. And a couple of times I was asked if I would like to work with them on a project because they needed a certain expertise. And when I was available, I wound up being tasked to go on overseas assignments, and that was the beginning of my introduction to the overseas part of the company.
Interesting. What do you remember about your first projects abroad?
Uh,
Hmm.
well, my first project where I actually traveled overseas was to Yemen. And what I remember most about that is landing in the dark, getting through customs. And customs is the same in every country in the world. They're not the friendliest people in the world. And getting through that, getting in a car, and then having to go through a military checkpoint with a guy putting an AK-47 in my face, in the car traveling to where we were going to stay.
Hmm.
It certainly brought home the idea that I was not back in New Jersey.
Wow. Not in North Jersey, anyway.
Yes.
So what happened then? You went to the hotel and
Yes, we went to the hotel, and next day we went off to see the client. What we were tasked with doing on that particular assignment was the company had a contract with the United Nations Development Program to develop master plans for um, the 5 largest cities in Yemen, and 2 of them had been completed, and then 3 still were yet to be done. And so 2, no, 3 had been completed, and 2 needed to be done. And we went and met the client, told them our basic plan, and we were given, the blessing to go ahead. And we organized going out to the first city to do our data collection for that.
how long were you there?
About 6 weeks. We traveled back and forth originally from the capital city in Sana'a to the first city, which was called Damar, which you could go back and forth in a day, and collected a lot of information in Damar. I met my first camel face to face. Tried to eat my backpack.
Mhm.
I was counting traffic at the time. Met some Yemenis who were shepherds. We exchanged some water and food, and then we finished in Damar, and then went all the way down to Taiz, which is further south, and worked in Taiz for a few days.
So at the end of that trip, was there a plan to go back, or was that?
Yeah, I did go back. We went back, prepared our analyses and reports, and then I went back with one of the principals of the company at the time, and the UN had hired a British expert to sort of check the work we had done, and we went back and met with him, and then we did presentations to the committee in the government, and everything was accepted, and it was a successful project.
And at that point, were you hooked on the international?
Well, I really liked the idea of going for what I considered a good amount of time, anywhere for a month to 2 months.
Mm-hmm.
But the company liked to send people over for 6 months to 2 years, because once you get the person out there, and they're out there, and you don't have to worry about flying them back and forth and paying the expenses. So I like the idea of staying close, working in the United States, but staying close. And when there was an interesting assignment, telling my U.S. boss that I had some time, and telling the international guys that, hey, I'm available if you got anything. So I had my cake and ate it too. Very much so.
When did you start to get promoted internally? How early in your career?
After about 4 years, I was promoted to a senior level rank, senior, professional rank. My career sort of took a little detour in that the company was invited to produce a proposal for a large military project, which was the deployment of what was then called the MX missile.
Mm-hmm.
Out in Wyoming. Well, there were many basing strategies. The last one where they actually went was in Wyoming, and I helped write that proposal, which was a fascinating experience for me. And The company actually won this job in joint venture with another American firm uh, called URS, which is doesn't exist anymore. And I was out back and forth to Wyoming and California, where the headquarters of the Air Force Ballistic Missile Office was, for the next 4 years. And it was, I think, partly as a result of that, my work on the proposal, and I ran a section of that project that when I was back full time in New Jersey at the headquarters, I was promoted to head um, what was then the environmental division. It had a title. It had a what our title structure was after that: senior principal, and then if you're going to be more on the if you're going to run an operation, the next first rung of that was director, and I was a director of the operation, which had shrunk in my absence to only 8 people.
But that was kind of back in those days. That was sort of the beginning of the environmental enforcement
Very much
movement,
so.
right?
Very much so.
So then what happened?
Well, it is now my job for the 8 people to go out and win work and supervise the work, make sure the quality was right, make sure we came in on budget, and so we made some money. And so I had to teach myself the business of the business.
Hmm.
I think our field is a very unique field in that nobody really comes into the field trained in the business aspects.
Mm.
You come in as a professional of some type, whether it's like a hard engineering professional or a more soft professional, and someplace along the line you start learning how the business works.
So true. I feel like they should teach some of it in all professional schools.
Oh, believe me, I've had this discussion. I was teaching for a while at Rutgers after I retired,
Hmm.
and I was trying to. Well, both I was on the board at NJIT for a while, and I argued that their engineering program needed to have a business aspect to it, because if their engineering students could go into their early jobs with some idea of how the business worked, they would be much more valuable to whatever company they work for than if they were just understood the technical work. It wasn't a popular view because everybody said, well, if you're an engineer, you should worry about engineering things, not business. Well, okay, but that's great until somebody has to have work to do.
Hmm. When I was a trustee at Union College, there was a committee, and I was asked to interview CEOs from various disciplines, some engineers, some in banking, some insurance, and almost to a person, to a CEO, um, giving advice to a trustee at a liberal arts college. They said, "Send me kids that can read a financial statement."
Yeah,
I
yeah.
appreciate the fact that they're an engineer, but I don't want to teach them the basics of business. And
Well, what I used to wind up doing, and now my small operation, which eventually grew,
mm,
uh, I would regularly hold meetings for the key people to, this is the balance sheet, this is an income statement,
mm,
this is what cash flow means. Now, in all honesty, I only learned it 2 weeks before myself.
mm-hmm,
So I had to teach all these things
mm-hmm.
because nobody knew.
So I'm assuming as you focused on the environmental division, it became a big business unit of.
It became eventually, let's see, this is in the mid, and when I started, it was in the mid to late 80s. And by the mid 90s, it was the largest operation in Berger and the most profitable.
What were the revenues overall at Berger then?
Um, Someplace between 50 and 75 million.
And the environmental division?
We were probably, well, we got up to about 35.
And how long were you presiding over the environmental division before you ended up getting into senior management?
Well, I got promoted from director to vice president, and then Berger had a highest level of management, operational management, was called a group vice president, and by 1990 or 91, I was made a group vice president, and I was also invited to become a partner in the firm. You know, although it's a corporation, Berger was managed and its culture was very much of an old style partnership,
Mm-hmm.
as were many firms, engineering firms.
Mm-hmm. And simultaneously, the international division is maintaining or growing or shrinking.
No, there were two basic international operations: Europe and Africa, and Europe, Africa, and then Asia and South America. And Europe and Africa primarily shrunk uh, a lot. One of the things that began happening is the funders of development work shifted a lot of their money out of Africa, particularly after the fall of the Soviet Union.
Mm.
Countries like the US or Britain or others sent a lot of their international assistance dollars to Russia to help it recover from its Soviet days.
Mm-hmm.
And the Africans really got sort of left by the wayside.
Mm.
Now, on the other hand, the Asian business, really took off. So it was really the environmental, which really we joined by 91 or 2, we joined the U.S. engineering operation and the U.S. environmental operation into one, and it became the U.S. operation. It was the U.S. operation and the Asian operations which really then dominated the company.
And at that point, did you have a focus one way or the other on the international component, trying to stabilize it or grow it?
No, at that time I was very much building the U.S. business.
Okay.
Um, and then I got tasked in, I don't know, 95 or something with examining how design build was beginning to start up in the U.S. It was very common overseas, but in the U.S., design build was really not a major form of project delivery. I got tasked with by the then president of the company to see how we, examine that and see what we could do to be more active if that started to grow in the U.S. And in the process of that, I came back and I said, yes, it's likely to grow in the U.S., but there'll be a lot of competition.
Mm-hmm.
But what I noticed was there was very little, if any, competition in managing the maintenance of, this was mostly transportation focused, of transportation facilities that, and I could see that the trends in funding, we were building less and less new facilities, and the money was shifting to more and more maintenance.
Mm-hmm.
So I said, there might be an opportunity in what I called maintenance management that we might want to pursue. And I was told, well, go ahead. Berger had if you had an idea, you were allowed to pursue it, basically.
Mm.
And if it worked, fine, keep writing that idea. But so that's what I did. And coming out of that, to make a long story short, was we wound up forming a company called VMS Incorporated. And it was basically a joint venture company between Berger and Sverdrup, which was a company based out of St. Louis, which later got purchased by Jacobs. But in the beginning, it was Berger and Sverdrup. And we did what's very unusual in our business. We created sole source ideas and went around and sold it. Now, then it would be competed, but we won. So we won our first major contract in Virginia, where we became responsible for well, a little over 100 miles of interstate highway in Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
And it was the first contract of its kind in the United States. Now, this was being done in Britain, and we were doing it a little differently than it had been done in Britain, but we got sole source contract. I mean, lump sum fixed price contracts for 5 years with a 5-year additional option to maintain everything about a highway, whether it's the pavement, the crossing bridges, drainage, everything. And it became one of the, well, it was definitely at that time the largest project Berger had ever done.
Mm-hmm.
It was, I mean, combined, my numbers might be off, but it was a $350, $400 million job for Berger.
Wow.
And it became extraordinarily profitable. And we formed a separate company around it. And I was dispatched from the environmental operation or U.S. operation to run this company. I moved down to Richmond, Virginia. And from Richmond, we won contracts in Florida, Texas, Oklahoma, Alaska, and a couple other places. We built the company to well over $100 million a year.
What year roughly was that?
96 is, I think, when I moved to Virginia.
Okay. How'd you like living in Richmond?
Well, you know, Virginia is a nice place. I liked it quite a bit. You're 2 hours from everything. 2 hours from Washington, D.C., 2 hours from the beach, 2 hours from the mountains.
Mm-hmm.
Coming from New Jersey, there was relatively little traffic. I mean, everybody who was from Richmond thought there was horrible traffic, but basically you can get any place in the Virginia area, in the Richmond area in 20 minutes. I really liked it. My wife was not super enthusiastic because it was hot, very hot. And I liked hot weather.
Mm-hmm.
She did not like hot weather.
My
kids loved Virginia, Richmond. She was less enthusiastic.
Mm. How long were you there?
We lived there for 6 years because like in year 5 or so, I was asked to come back to Berger directly and take over as CEO of the company. So, you know, do I want to stay in Virginia and keep building VMS, or do I want to go back and run all of Berger? And I thought all of Berger might be more interesting. Mm-hmm. So I did.
So you were a senior manager at that time. Was it a surprise to you at all that you were named CEO at that time? Were we expecting it?
I thought you know, myself and 1 or 2 other people were likely successors.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't a complete surprise.
Okay.
I mean, what I had going for me is I had grown an operation from, you know, almost nothing to fairly large.
Mm-hmm.
And I had developed new markets and successfully penetrated those new markets and hired really good people. And so that was my claim to fame. And, you know, even though Berger was growing, my efforts made it grow a lot faster. And the company, I'd say by when I took over, we were just under 200 million in revenue, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe a touch more.
It sounds to me like every business you got involved in grew.
Pretty much. You know, I I did okay. I had a couple that didn't work out so well,
Mm-hmm.
but pretty much. I mean, back in the late '90s when I was still at VMS, I was asked to write a sort of a strategic plan for Berger overall, and I basically part of that plan was that we would eventually achieve 500 million in revenues,
Mm-hmm.
And we exceeded it.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, we eventually got to 1.2 billion.
Mm-hmm.
So and Berger stepped up with working with the former president who remained chairman of the company, and I was the CEO. We stepped up our acquisitions, and we had a fair amount of business coming from the firms that we had purchased.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a very unique style of purchase,
Mm-hmm.
different from, again, most of our competitors.
How so?
We rarely ever bought 100% of a company
Mm-hmm.
because our theory was, and this is a cliche in the engineering world, your assets all go out the door every night, and their culture becomes relatively unique to them. And if you were going to purchase them and get the best out of them, they had to have a stake in everything. So we would buy maybe up to 60% of a company if we could,
Mm-hmm.
and leave 40% with it might not be the management that was there when we purchased because they may have retired, but with the local management, and which that gave them substantial incentive to make this thing positive. And we didn't really impose on them, our own styles and things.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that, I don't know, we had about 7 or 8 firms we had purchased that way, and they were very, very successful.
Mm-hmm.
We tried to buy firms that were more specialized than we were. So, for example, we bought a company in Seattle who at that time was called ABAM Engineers, and they were precast concrete specialists, and they did very unique structures. And their older people, their original people, were retiring, and we bought the company, and boy, they did fantastic for the next several years. We bought a company in Canada in the same way that were geotech engineers, especially in the mining industry, and they were struggling when we bought them, but they were so good that if our business acumen could help turn them around, they were going to be fantastic. And partly buoyed by the commodity cycle, those guys were earning 35 and 40% EBITDA working for mining companies.
Wow. And they just needed a little help with the business side, it sounds like.
Well, we created what we call a management technique tool, which we called operating committees.
Mm-hmm.
Usually myself and my predecessor, the chairman, we would visit each company 4 times a year mostly. Sometimes it was a little less, but quarterly basically. And we would meet with the company management, the key operating managers of that company. So there would be the president of the company, his key deputies, and his financial person.
Mm-hmm.
And it would be the chairman and myself. And the chairman was a whiz financially. I wasn't bad, but he was better. And I was better on the sort of strategic operational side. And so between the two of us, they would present what's going on, and we might make a suggestion here, a suggestion there. But the biggest thing we did was introduce the idea of accountability. You are going to have to sit in front of your peers and us and tell us how you achieve the objective you said you would achieve, or why you didn't. And it's a great motivator.
Mm-hmm.
If you're accountable, you wind up producing.
Mm-hmm.
And they did.
Who was the chairman at that time?
Derish Wolf.
Okay. And Dr. Berger had retired?
Dr. Berger passed away in, I don't have the year correct, 97, 98.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, in the tradition of our industry, he worked to the day he died.
Mm-hmm. So the international division started to grow again, I would think.
It did because, in the 90s during the Clinton administration,
Mm-hmm.
the U.S. really stepped back from bilateral development aid and switched the focus of its aid from infrastructure to education and health. I mean, all that's good, but from the point of view of an engineering operation, the infrastructure work now only came through the big development banks like the World Bank or Asian Development Bank or those kinds of agencies. The U.S. Agency for International Development was not a big funder of development work. However, 9/11 changed all that. All of a sudden, the U.S. jumped with both feet back into the world, um, and at the same time, the European Union really got itself organized internally and became big funders of development work, particularly in Africa.
Mm.
So the African operation, which had shrunk greatly, all of a sudden now had a new source of clients, and so their operations grew at a very fast clip. And with the Afghanistan work, which Berger won the first Afghanistan reconstruction contract to come out of the United States. We went up against 5 firms were invited. I mean, all the biggest U.S. firms, Bechtel, Fluor, and us, who was considerably smaller, but we won.
And were you, at that time, were you going over to Afghanistan yourself?
Yeah, I did go over to Afghanistan, yes, several times. Well, in the beginning, you could still see all the remnants of the Soviet Afghanistan war, downed helicopters and in the middle of the city, blown up buildings all over. But as time went on, the country became a little more normalized, and the Taliban at that time was not a major threat or as big a threat as it became. People are very nice, very friendly. The food was very good. There were worse places to be in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a fascinating place. I mean, keep in mind that this is these cities were part of the Silk Road from China
Mm-hmm.
to the west. Alexander the Great marched right through Kabul and Kandahar and crossed the passes into India. I mean, you were in the middle of history.
Mm-hmm.
Fascinating place. Now, whether we should have stayed as long as we stayed, you could argue that question. If our objective was, the objective morphed from getting some basic infrastructure fixed in the country to, started calling nation building. And I remember I wrote an email to my wife to tell her I had arrived successfully, and I made a comment that I said, anybody who thinks that this place is going to become a modern democracy in our lifetimes is crazy.
Mm.
I mean, we're back in the 14th century here.
Did you read the Afghan campaign?
I don't know that one specifically.
Uh, it's a book by Stephen Pressfield about the quest of Alexander the Great. And
Oh, okay.
my conclusion after having read the book was not much has changed.
Well, I can tell you that not much has changed. I mean, I read about the British army being destroyed twice in Afghanistan, and you could see why. I mean, these mountains are enormous,
Mm-hmm.
and you're there and maintaining your logistics. It is really hard, and when the winter comes, the weather is horrible.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Berger, in order to operate, one of our first assignments was the ring road that goes around the country, and President Bush had promised the president of Afghanistan at the time, Hamid Karzai, and that road would be finished uh, by the end of the year, which was 7 months away.
Hmm.
You ever do a road in 7 months?
Mm-hmm.
And 300 miles long?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that took quite a bit of not only engineering, but logistical planning, plus security. I mean, we had to form our own security. At one time, Berger had the third largest armed force in Afghanistan after the American Army, the British Army, and the U.S. security, the Louis Berger Security Group.
Did you get the road done in 7 months?
Yes,
That's incredible.
without the surface topping, to be honest,
Mm-hmm.
but you could travel it, and you could travel it at high speed. And in the spring, we put the final pavement layers on.
Mm-hmm. So at some point, the road got rocky abroad.
Well, the U.S. started making lots of mistakes in Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm.
The Taliban was resurgent. It became a very difficult place to work. I mean, how many private sector contracts that do you know of that says build a dam, a school, a highway, whatever, in the middle of a war?
Mm-hmm.
So, it became rather difficult. We started losing a lot of people,
Mm-hmm.
mostly our security guards, but some of our engineers as well.
Mm-hmm.
I know one of the times I was over, I went. We had an Indian engineer from India who was working with us, and he was in a car that had been destroyed by an IED, and he was killed. And and I went and met his wife in Mumbai and talked to his wife and her brother-in-law, the guy's brother, met his children. It was a very difficult thing to do.
Mm.
I gave a speech in Kabul about a guy had been killed on the road who was a security guard. And I remember his father, through a translator, telling me that his son loved this job because it was the only thing he ever did that did not involve tearing things down.
Mm.
That stays with me, has stayed with me forever. One guy helped save a couple of our people as a security guard, and he's a very bright guy, and we wound up putting him through engineering school in the United States.
Mm. So at that point, were you spending large amounts of time in Afghanistan? Or?
Well, I was spending some time, mostly, it's one part of the company, but it's
Mm-hmm.
becoming a very big company.
Mm-hmm.
And following our operating committee concept, we had, at that time, we had, my numbers are a little off. It's either 8 or 9 operating companies. We had the original Louis Berger, that's an operating company. And then we had our French company, which is what oversaw Africa for us. And then we had other companies in different places, the Canadian company, the Seattle company. We had a company in New York City, the old Alman and Whitney Bridge Company. we had other, so when you add it up and you're going to these operating committee meetings 4 times a year, um, that's a lot of travel.
Mm-hmm.
So you're fitting other things into that schedule.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was successful because we really grew, and then we eventually sold out our position in the maintenance management company um, to an Australian firm. Highest economic return on any investment Berger ever made.
That's great. So, at what point did you learn that the U.S. government was displeased with the Berger Group?
Yeah, yeah. It's one thing to go from darling on Monday to bum on Tuesday.
Hmm.
It's a little disconcerting. So we grew really fast in the early part in the first decade of the century, and I could see that our accounting approach had problems. That it really didn't comply completely. Little did I know at the time of how much it didn't comply, but it didn't really comply with the government cost accounting standards. And and the chairman at the time said, "Well, yes, I see what you're saying, Nick, but we pass this all the time. It's not an issue. Don't worry about it much." Well, in 2006, uh, the government raided Louis Berger's offices with 65 armed FBI and IG and other kinds of agents to seize information. It's coincidental that we happened to be moving from our long-time headquarters in East Orange, New Jersey, out to Morristown.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a lot of confusion going on. And so that's when I knew we had a problem.
So, where were you the moment you knew?
I was driving into the office and I could see all these guys running around in blue windbreakers with FBI on the back.
Mm.
I parked my car and I came up to one guy and I said, "I'm the CEO." I says, "Oh, we were looking for you." Went up to my office and they started asking me questions, and I could see this is going to be a real issue. They had the chairman in his office. They were asking him questions, and I managed to get on the phone to Fred Berger, who was Dr. Berger's son,
Mm-hmm.
who was in our Washington D.C. office, and I told him what was happening. And I say, "If you know any lawyers, I get a couple of lawyers over here."
Mm.
And he called someone he knew from high school because he went to school in West Orange, and they sent a lawyer over, and so we made sure there was a lawyer present when as many people as possible who were being interviewed. Uh, at least we knew what their questions they were being asked and things like that. And that was the beginning. And they, served a subpoena on us for all our records and stuff, and we had to work with them on that. These things are written very broadly. They wanted every single piece of paper, and I asked the question to the U.S. Department of Justice attorney. "So you say every piece of paper? I mean, most of what we do here are design plans for transportation facilities. Do you want all the plans and the calculation sheets?" And they looked at me like they didn't understand what I was talking about. I said, "Well, what do you want?" So we narrowed it down to the kinds of things they wanted, because they obviously didn't want to see the design of the bridge.
Mm.
So and so we went through a long period of them doing their supplying their activities, and of course we were doing our own um, investigation of what's really going on here. And I figured it had something to do with the accounting issues that I had been finding, and we had tried to tell AID that we thought we had some problems, but they really didn't respond when we had told them that first. Of course, now they shocked to find out there were problems. Um,
Hmm.
so it started a long process of we had to do an official internal investigation. The law firm we hired to do that, and that took a couple of years to do. Um, and then we had to present that information to the government. Then we had to negotiate with the government. All that took to I think 2010. We actually arrived at a settlement agreement with the government. But in the course of that, we found out that what had inspired everything from the government side was a whistleblower lawsuit, and from a different part of the Department of Justice, and and that whistleblower lawsuit, which we couldn't get access to for some time, but eventually did, basically targeted our chairman um, for things.
Hmm. So the negotiations commence. Eventually, they determine there's a fine. It was a very large
Yeah,
fine.
yeah. It was a. I learned a lot of things. Is it really doesn't make any difference what the law says
Mm-hmm.
when you pay a fine from the government. It's really how much money do you have and how much of that are they going to take?
Mm-hmm.
And they took a lot. They took about $50 million.
Mm-hmm.
We had calculated that based upon the system, probably about 35 was the right number, but it's not a very even negotiation when you negotiate with the Department of Justice.
They didn't ask your opinion.
Not really.
Oh, it's not funny. So then what did you do?
You can only laugh in retrospect.
Yeah.
Well, we eventually signed a settlement. We thought we were going to get a what's called a non-prosecution agreement, um, but we wound up with one step higher than that. And we had to manage all our other clients at the same time. We didn't want any of our other clients to feel that we, were a bunch of crooks or anything. So
Mm-hmm.
we paid our fine. We paid it over a schedule of years, and and we had to reform, of course, all our systems, which we had already started doing,
Mm-hmm.
because as we did the internal investigation, we got deeply into the issues that I had originally raised and saw where we needed to change.
Mm.
But we also found at that same time in our internal investigation, there were 4 instances overseas where some of the transactions were, shall we say, suspicious. So we had a big soul searching discussion internally. Do we report this as part of our internal investigation, since it really has nothing to do with what's going on in the US? Because these could be potential violations of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which was a law not much enforced in the United States until really the end of the 90s, early 2000s. We eventually decided we should report it. And much to our surprise, they wouldn't include that in our overall settlement that we agreed to, because it was a different part of the Justice Department that handled Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So we had to start all over again with new people in the Department of Justice in Washington, now in Washington, D.C., no longer the U.S. Attorney's Office in New Jersey. And we had it wound up having to do a whole nother internal investigation focused on foreign corrupt practice potential.
How did that end up?
It ended up fairly well. We of the 4 instances that started this whole thing, we only found, I think, 2 of them really had some issue, but we found a couple other issues. And what made it complicated was the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act people referred everything that was happening to the World Bank's integrity department and to the European Union. So all of a sudden, we've got other government agencies and transnational agencies that nobody controls. So how do we manage investigations? And we wound up with a simultaneous investigation from the World Bank, the European Union. We were advised to do nothing, and that turned out to be the right advice. And the critical path through everything became the World Bank. And the reason was some of our largest U.S. clients gave great legitimacy to the World Bank. And if they sanctioned us in any way, we would have lost our domestic U.S. work with those clients. And that would have been a very, very big blow. Could have put us out of business actually. So the World Bank became the most difficult part of the whole thing. And I sought advice, and I got advice from some outside people of how to deal with them. And we followed that, and we came with a very successful conclusion with the World Bank. We were suspended for less than a year. And less than a year is considered the lightest sanction from the World Bank, and they very much liked what we had already changed in the systems. So we actually became a poster child for them of how to reform. And that then eventually helped us get through the FCPA, and we paid another 15 million or so, 17 million dollar fine, and we were able to pay that, and we were done.
So then, they're taking these big chunks of cash from you, whether it's all at once or over a period of time. Right. You need cash to operate. What did you do?
Well, two things. We did have a couple of banks leave us because they didn't want to be associated with us during this whole thing. So we used our line of credit a little, not much, but a little. But fortunately, we had won some other contracts that were highly lucrative. And remember, some of our other companies, like the company in Canada with a 45% EBITDA, are just throwing off cash left and right. And that cash paid for everything. Now, in effect, the total cost of everything, our equity would have been 50% higher than it was at the time everything ended. But nobody took a blow to their investments. I mean, if you had $10 worth of Berger stock on day one, you still had $10 worth of Berger stock on day 365. But it didn't grow as much as it could have because we spent all this money on the lawyers. So between the other companies that we had throwing off cash and a couple of very lucrative contracts we had, we were able to pay for everything.
Where does Bob Abrams come in on?
Well, so we've gone through this whole thing, but at the same time, partners are getting older. They want to retire. Some people just wanted to leave because they didn't like what had gone on. And even though we had maybe 24 or 5 partners at that time, the holdings were very concentrated in 3 people. The chairman, who was no longer the chairman by now, he was gone from the company. the Fred Berger, Dr. Berger's son, and um, uh, a French engineer who, with Darish, had been builders of the company in the earlier years. So they had about 75% of the company. So I had a plan. How can I get, how can I, Darish, even though Darish was gone from the company and the government was accusing him of being a mastermind in a fraudulent scheme, contractually, we still owed him his money.
Mm-hmm.
We had no basis not to pay him.
Mm-hmm.
They hadn't convicted him of anything by that time. So, so we got to pay him. We got to pay the French guy who was older and wanted to wind down. We had to pay some other people. So I came up with two solutions. And we put the two together. One was bring in an outside investment that would not dominate, not purchase the entire firm, and we would just be employees of that private equity operation, but bring in an actual investor, and that was Abrams, plus create an ESOP inside the company to, and between the ESOP and the Abrams, we basically absorbed 50% of all the shares and made the future ownership now have a path forward.
To me, that's the greatest part of the story. You managed through extraordinarily difficult times. You had many people's life savings on the line that were buying shares for their entire careers. And the stakes were so high.
Yes. Very, very high.
Mm-hmm.
So I came up with this. Someone I knew helped introduce. We didn't know it was going to be Abrams.
Mm-hmm.
We had a couple of we called them the Boston investment and the New York investment. One was from New York, and one was from and Abrams was from Boston.
Mm-hmm.
And I explained all this to the shareholders. I explained the ESOP concept to them, and we went around and not only did I do a general discussion before all of the partners, shareholders, but I also went out to each operation and met with small groups of partners and shareholders. I brought Jim Stamatis with me,
Mm-hmm.
and a couple of times I brought a couple other people with me, and we went over everything, explained what the situation was and how this was preparing us for the future. That we'd have to manage the private investment coming in.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't really want to be we wanted to be owned by the people who did the work.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then we got a committee together to interview the New York guys and the Boston guys, and it's pretty clear to me that we were going to wind up going to Boston, and everybody who on that little committee agreed, and then we eventually struck a deal with Dave Abrams.
Mm-hmm.
And he turned out to be a terrific partner.
Mm-hmm. That's great. It's a happy ending to a great American company and a tribute to you. And I apologize for saying Bob Abrams. I meant Dave. It's a great story.
It's a good story. The problem for me personally is, I spent the last few years of my life managing lawyers, not engineers.
Right.
Engineers like to work together. Lawyers hate to work together.
Right.
I actually threatened to break their kneecaps once if they didn't cooperate. And it was difficult. So by 2015, I was totally worn out.
Mm-hmm.
And I told the board that I really need to step aside. I could remain on the board if that's what the shareholders wanted, but I didn't have the energy to take us. Now that we now had a platform to grow again, I couldn't oversee that platform.
Understood.
And the board did its own internal review and search. I had recommended Jim for the job, and they agreed, and the partners all voted for Jim Stamatis to take my position.
That's great.
And then I stepped back to just be on the board.
Thank you for telling me that story. It's I've heard it lots of times from lots of different people, but never with this level of detail. And and you and I've talked about it, but
Yeah.
this was
Yeah.
fascinating for me. Is there anything that you might like to say or ask me as we get to the end of our conversation before we wrap up?
Well, I don't know. I think I stayed true to what I saw my responsibilities as which was to deliver quality work to our clients and protect the investments of my partners.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody probably has an opinion whether I did that well or not, but I think I did okay.
Yeah, I do too. And I think that's the popular sentiment among the people we know in common. I mean, nobody's perfect, but it was a Herculean effort, and you.
It was. One of the biggest decisions I made way in the beginning was that I had to handle all this personally,
Mm-hmm.
and limit the amount of work I needed from other people
Mm-hmm.
in the company, because this kind of thing absorbs you.
Mm-hmm.
We had to continue our work for our clients,
Mm-hmm.
bring in cash, win new work.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I got everybody involved,
Mm-hmm.
it would have destroyed us.
Yeah,
You
had to
Larry,
protect your people, really.
exactly. Larry Walker, Jim Bach,
Mm-hmm.
Jim Stamatis a little. We
Mm-hmm.
really had to keep it confined.
Mm-hmm.
But the flip side of that is, like I said, I wore myself out.
Right. It's a heavy burden. Well, thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. This has been a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate it.
Sure, anytime. Loved it. Thank you.
All righty. Thanks. Bye.
Take care.
If you enjoy the most fascinating podcast in the world, please follow on Spotify, subscribe on YouTube, and follow on Apple Podcast.